Want to get to another top story right here as we do take a live look outside the Capitol in D.C. Less than a week remains until the deadline to prevent a partial government shutdown. House Republicans have unveiled a spending bill that would keep federal agencies funded through the end of September. Now, the 99-page bill released this weekend would provide a slight boost to defense programs while trimming non-defense programs below the 2024 budget year levels. That approach likely to be a non-starter for most Democrats who have long insisted that defense and non-defense spending move in the same direction. Congress has until midnight Friday to avoid that partial government shutdown. As always, a lot to break down here, so I do want to bring in Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian. Thank you so much, Rich, as always, for taking the time to be here with us.
Thank you so much for having me on again, Josh.
Of course. Well, first off, I do want to ask you kind of the overall picture here. Why is it that Republicans would support this and Democrats wouldn't?
Because there are certain cuts in it that they certainly support. They believe that defense, most of them are defense hawks, like most of them on the Armed Services Committee are rather defense hawks. So they want more money to be appropriated for defense. This one obviously has slight increases in defense spending. Some conservatives are a little bit incredulous, a little bit skeptical rather of this legislation. I think that Donald Trump has done everything he can to try to propitiate them. He's gotten pretty much just about all of them members of the Freedom Caucus, congressmen like Andy Harris, the chairman of the Freedom Caucus, Tim Burchett, congressman from Tennessee, is very much coming along. They really only have one vote to spare, literally, in the House of Representatives, 2 votes to spare rather. And Thomas Macy of Kentucky is pretty much going to be a no vote, as he usually is on these. He's very much of a libertarian-minded Republican, so they really only have 1 vote to spare here.
Kind of going into that a little bit deeper, I mean, overall, do Republicans really need that support from Democrats?
Oh, absolutely. Unless they can get a completely monolithic, completely united United States Congress, United States House of Representatives with only one defection, they need some Democrats. So where do they go for that? Well, they're certainly not going to go for the leadership. The leadership is pretty much universally opposed to it. They could go for some moderate to conservative Democrats, including the 13 who currently represent congressional districts that voted last time around for Donald Trump, like Henry Cuellar, for example, with Texas would be one. They could certainly go for Jared Golden, who comes from Maine, who represents the district that went about 8 points for Donald Trump last time. So that's really where they have to go potentially. They can make the argument that they can make the argument that they potentially would take this off the table as an issue that the Republicans would use against the Democrats if those Democrats were to vote with President Trump on this legislation.
As far as the issues here, we talked about defense and non-defense spending. What are kind of the highlights of, this overall? Again, we're talking 99 pages, so I don't expect that you read through it all. I definitely didn't. But what are some of the highlights?
Yes, and there certainly are certain parts of, for example, the Republicans are making the case that most of the cuts will simply be cuts in terms of growth of programs. Democrats are saying that it essentially goes too far. One of them is the IRS. There are certainly going to be cuts in IRS funding, which probably is popular with the body politic, with the American people. But many Democrats believe that they are very much supportive rather of IRS agents. So those are some of the things that are really in the legislation. I think that generally speaking, a lot of the entitlement programs, if you're thinking of Social Security, Medicare, for example, those are really in a different type of appropriation. So those probably really will not be touched in this legislation. But the one thing that does increase is defense spending. And that is something that there are certainly some Democrats who are very much opposed to some of the increases in defense spending, but there really haven't been any Democrat defection so far.
We've been through this a few times. You and I have spoken about it, but what happens during a partial government shutdown for folks out there who only kind of know bits and pieces about it?
Well, basically, essential employees continue to go to work. The United States military, for example, does not completely disband during this. What's considered essential employees continue to work, continue to collect a paycheck. What happens is what the federal government deems non-essential employees, for example, many who work in the U.S. Park Service is just one example, do not go to work during that period of time. Technically speaking, it's not an actual government shutdown. It's a quote-unquote partial government shutdown because the entire government is not necessarily shut down. We've had this in our history going back to 1980. Some of the more influential ones were 1995, 1996, when Bill Clinton, after losing 52 seats in the House of Representatives in 1990, in the 1994 midterms, he lost the House, he lost the Senate, the first time the Democrats had lost the House basically in 40 years. He started to come back to political life, if you will, in part by supporting some of the more popular domestic programs. They went to a government shutdown between Bill Clinton, Newt Gingrich, and Bob Dole. And I think by most estimations, Bill Clinton came out beneficial of that. Donald Trump went through this in 2018, 2019 for 35 days, which is a record. So we certainly have been there before. But I think that anyone who thinks that the government will completely disband is that's certainly wrong. It's just a partial government shutdown.
Why are these happening so often? Has that been the case? You talked about a few, that have happened in the past. It's nothing new, but are they happening more often, and why?
It sure seems that I think partly because the parties are so closely divided and they generally seem to be so monolithic. It used to be a day when you would have conservative Democrats crossing over to vote with the Republicans, and you had liberal Republicans crossing over to vote with the Democrats. Today, you have a scenario where most Republicans vote monolithically with their party, most Democrats vote monolithically with their respective party. Consequently, you really don't have a lot of crossover votes. So it's very hard sometimes to work across the aisle. Now, there are minor bills, minor pieces of legislation you don't hear too much about where the both parties do work together. But in terms of major legislation, in terms of it, sometimes even the 12 appropriations bills that you have to pass to have the government funded, it can be very tough sledding, it can be very perilous. And I think that's really why it's just so bifurcated from a partisan vantage point today.
All right, Rich Rubino, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us here. We appreciate it. Anything you want to add?
I would just say that the one that I think that Republicans need to really look at, where they really probably lost politically, was 1995, 1996. Bill Clinton had been relatively unpopular, job approval rating around 40%, but he tended to defend many of the government programs, and consequently, he ended up winning in almost a landslide in 1996. So I think sometimes Republicans can do this at their own peril. But but they do have to sometimes watch out from a public relations standpoint, the way that the Democrats try to frame this issue.
All right. Thank you again, Rich, for taking the time to join us here. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Josh.
And of course, I do want to take another live look here outside of the Capitol building over in D.C. You can see it there as the deadline for that partial government shutdown is fast approaching. A deal has to be approved by midnight on Friday. No question. We're going to keep you covered on all of the developments here on Live Now from Fox.